This is Note-Taking Guide 6.7 for Mathematical Decision Making for Life. Today we're going to talk about something called the standard deviation, and we're not going to get really in depth into this. We're going to just skim the surface of how to do it. Later on we'll talk about more about what it is and what it does, but today we're just going to do the math behind it so that you can be ready to have those more in-depth discussions later. So previously, the median was used to measure central tendency while looking at our data in a box and whisker plot. To do that, we use the median, the minimum, the maximum, quartile 1 and quartile 3 measurements. So today we're going to look at the mean as the measure of central tendency and its graphical representation. To do this, we're going to have to find the mean, the variance, and the standard deviation. So here's an example of what a bell curve looks like. It represents a normal distribution of data and what a standard deviation represents. So again, this normal bell curve right here, this middle line right here, this is where our mean or our average would be at. And then the length from here to here would be called a standard deviation. It tells you how far to go to the next important position on your bell curve. So one standard deviation away from the mean, which is represented by this Greek alphabet letter right here, in either direction on the horizontal axis accounts for about 68% of the data. Two standard deviations away from the mean accounts for roughly 95% of the data. And with three standard deviations away from the mean, you represent about 99% of the data. So what it's saying is if I went from here to here as well as this direction, then this would be 68% of my data roughly. If I went from here to here, then I would get 95% of my data roughly. And if I went from here all the way to here, then I would get roughly 99% of my data included in the representation of this bell curve. So that's kind of what a standard deviation tells us, is it tells us how far from the mean we're going to move. Really today though, we're going to focus on the mathematics behind it and just figure out how to do the math. So standard deviation, in order to find the standard deviation, the first thing we have to do is find the mean. Now the mean is represented by this x with a bar over the top of it. So when you see that in the formula, that's really just the average of the x's. So next we're going to find the difference. So we're going to take our original x values and subtract the mean from it. Then we're going to square that. So again, the original x value minus the average squared. And then here it is in a formula right here. It says take the sum, because that's the sum for a symbol. Take the sum of all of your x's minus your averages squared, divided by the number of numbers that you have. Now this formula is really kind of ugly the way that it looks, but this is how we find the standard deviation. And it looks ugly, but I'm going to give you a little charts to fill out that's going to make it easier to just do step by step. So here's a table that I've made for you guys to figure out the mean, the variance, and the standard deviation. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to take our information and we're going to put it into the table. So here's my numbers that I need to find the standard deviation for. So if you notice, those numbers have been put into the chart already as my x values. So here's my x values already in my chart. The next thing I'm going to do is find my mean. My mean is going to be the same number that gets put in the chart all the way up and down, because the mean is going to be the same for all of those numbers. We're going to use all of those numbers in order to find the mean. So to find the mean, we're going to add these numbers together. So grab your calculator. You're going to do 54 plus 53 plus 56 plus 59 plus 58 plus 54. And then in order to find the mean, we're going to divide that by the number of numbers there are. So we're going to divide that by 6. When you do that for the mean, I got 55.7. So the mean number that I'm going to put over here in my chart is 55.7. Okay, now if you follow the chart now says to do x minus the mean. So here's my x value, and I'm going to subtract the mean from it. I'm going to put my value back over into the chart, and I'm going to do that for every value. So I'm going to do 54 minus 55.7. When I did that, I got a negative 1.7. Then I do 53 minus 55.7. And when I got that, I got a negative 2.7. Then I do 56 minus 55.7. When I did that, I got 0.3. 59 minus 55.7. Just punch that in your calculator, you'll get 3.3. 58 minus 55.7 was 2.3. And 54 minus 55.7 was a negative 1.7. So there's the next part of my chart filled out for me. Now the next part of the chart says take all your x values minus the average, which is already this column right here. So we already did all of that part right there. We already took the x values and we already subtracted their average. So now all we have to do is square that number. So we're going to take the numbers over here in this column and we're going to square them and put them in the next column. So when we square a number, remember on your calculator, if it's a negative number, you're going to put it in parentheses and then square it so that your calculator will give you the correct sign on it. But think about it just for a minute. If you square negative 1.7, that would be a negative 1.7 times a negative 1.7. So you should always end up with a positive number when you're squaring something. So punch in your calculator, we're going to do negative 1.7 squared. When I punched that in my calculator, I got 2.89. Then I'm going to go negative 2.7 squared. I'm just going to punch that in my calculator. And when I did, I got 7.29. I'm going to do 0.3 squared, which is 0.09. 3.3 squared, which is 10.89. 2.3 squared, which is 5.29. And then the last one to square on your calculator we already did up at the very beginning. A negative 1.7 squared is again going to be that 2.89. Okay, so now what we have here is we have our entire chart filled out. And we just have to answer our questions. So the formula for the variance is right here. It says to find the variance, take the sum of all of those numbers that we did x minus the average squared. So here's my x minus the average squared column right here. I'm going to take all of those numbers and I'm going to sum them together because it says add them together. So I'm going to take all of these and I'm going to add them together. And then I have to divide them by the number of numbers that there are. In this case, there's 6 numbers. So I'm going to divide by 6 on the bottom. So I'm going to take a minute on my calculator. I'm going to add those all together. And then I'm going to divide it by 6. So I'm going to go on my calculator. 2.89 plus 7.29 plus 0.09 plus 10.89 plus 5.29 plus 2.89. And when I punched that all in my calculator, I got 29.34. So I have 29.34 for those added together, and I have to divide that by 6. That will give me my number for my variance. So when I divide by 6, I get 4.89, and that number would be my variance. There's my answer for my variance. And then the last thing I have to do is find my standard deviation. Now, if you take a minute to look at this formula for variance and the formula for standard deviation, there's only one thing that's different between this formula and this formula. If you notice, the only thing that's different between those two formulas is this square root on the outside. So all I have to do now is take that variance number, that 4.89, and I just have to square root it. When I square root it, that will be my standard deviation. So square root 4.89 on your calculator. And when I did that, I got 2.21. So again, you guys, this is the math behind finding the standard deviation. Not going to talk too much about what that actually means today. We're just doing the math behind it. So again, a little bit of math, but the chart helps a lot. So let's practice one more time and see if we can do it. So let's go back and let's just focus on our chart. If you notice, I gave you the numbers up here, and I already put them in your chart for you for your X values. So you don't actually have to write them in the chart. I already did that for you. So the first thing you're going to do is find that number that goes in the next column, which is the mean. The mean is the average, so you're going to find the average of those numbers. So take a calculator, add all of those numbers together, and then you're going to have to divide by the number of numbers that there are. And I counted 9 numbers. So after you add those together, divide by 9. So real quick on your calculator, 27 plus 30 plus 47 plus 35 plus 30 plus 40 plus 35 plus 22 plus 65. Get that number, divide that entire number by 9. And my calculator says 36.8. Hopefully you guys got the same thing as me, 36.8. So the number that comes over here into this chart is 36.8. So I'm now going to fill out my next column. My next column is my X value minus my average. So everyone, I take this column's number and I subtract this column's number from it. And I just put it in my chart. So 27 minus 36.8.